the 16th of July, 1546. The Smithfield Market Square in London is fully parked. A woman is about to be burned alive, not for murder, not for theft, not even for adultery. Her crime? Reading the Bible, having opinions, the audacity to believe that she, a mere woman, could think for herself about God. But here's the twist that made this execution unlike any other in Tudor England. They had tortured her so badly that she couldn't stand. Her name was Anne Askew, a noblewoman, a poet, a Protestant, and she was the only woman of noble birth ever tortured on the rack in England. What drove Henry VIII's government to break their own rules just to silence one woman? Why did the most powerful men in the kingdom fear her words more than entire armies? You're about to meet the woman who chose principle over survival, silence over betrayal, and conviction over life itself. This isn't just another tale of religious persecution. This is the story of the brutal torture and execution of Anne Askew, and yet she refused to break. But first, if you enjoy learning about the dark and hidden truths of history, please consider hitting that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment to let us know where you are watching from. Because some voices from history refuse to stay buried. Now, let's go back to where it all began, not in the flames of martyrdom, but in the quiet rebellion of a girl who dared to think differently. Anne Askew was born in 1521. Into privilege, but not into peace. She came from a respected Lincolnshire family. Her father, Sir William Askew, was a knight of the realm. She was educated, clever, and devout. But Anne's faith wasn't the kind that knelt quietly in church pews. She read the Bible in English, the forbidden translation, and not just in private. She quoted it, debated it, lived it. At 15, she was forced into a marriage meant for her deceased sister. Her husband, Thomas Kyme, expected obedience. What he got was something entirely different. Anne refused to attend Catholic Mass. She preached the gospel of faith alone, denouncing indulgences, relics, and the transformation of bread into God. Kyme threw her out. But instead of hiding, Anne did the unthinkable for a noblewoman. She walked into London under her maiden name. She literally took back her identity in an age when women were considered property. Talk about the original independent woman, anthem except instead of Beyoncé, it was a 16th century noblewoman with a death wish and an attitude problem. It wasn't just a personal rebellion, it was a declaration of war against both husband and church. But Anne wasn't alone in her beliefs. In Tudor London, faith had become a battleground. Imagine Twitter arguments, but with actual stakes and fire. The smoke hadn't yet cleared from the fires of earlier heretics, and Anne was about to step onto the front lines with all the survival instincts of someone walking into traffic while texting. In 1545, Anne was arrested for the first time. Her crime? Her words. She had said, plainly and without apology, that the bread and wine of the Mass were symbolic, not the literal body and blood of Christ. Now, to us, this sounds like a perfectly reasonable theological debate. To Henry VIII's government, this was like announcing that the king wore fake designer clothes. That belief struck at the heart of Catholic doctrine and directly challenged the law under Henry VIII, who, let's remember, had already executed 2 wives. But when she was dragged before a panel of bishops and scholarsmen who had spent their entire careers intimidating people into submission, Anne didn't stammer or apologize. She quoted scripture. She evaded their traps like a verbal ninja. She made bishops look like fools, which, historically speaking, is both impressive and suicidal. This time she managed to slip through their fingers. Not for long, though. Behind the scenes, whispers started. Because Anne wasn't just a nuisance. She was dangerous smart, composed, and connected. At court, some believed Anne had ties to Queen Catherine, a reform-minded queen in a country ruled by a king who changed wives like clothes and sent them to the scaffold just as quickly. The logic was terrifyingly simple. If Anne could be made to confess, if she could name names, then the reformist queen could be brought down. and with her, the entire Protestant movement at court would crumble. So they decided to break her, literally, and what happened there had never happened to a woman of her station before or since. It is the year 1546, Anne back into custody, but this time they didn't bring her to trial, they brought her to the Tower, not for judgment, for torture. Anne Askew has been imprisoned in the Tower of London, not for what she did, but for what they hoped she'd say. The stakes are no longer just Anne's soul. They want a confession, one name in particular, Queen Catherine Parr. Anne had visited reformist salons. She had written Protestant tracts. She was clever, persuasive, and dangerous. They believed she was part of a plot to turn the Queen herself against the King. Anne refused to speak. She definitely knew snitches get stitches. But what happened next shattered protocol and bones. No woman of noble birth had ever been racked in England before. But Anne was no ordinary woman, and this was no ordinary regime. Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and Sir Richard Rich personally took control of the interrogation and torture. Not content with silence, they turned the wheel themselves. Think about that for a moment. These weren't dungeon-dwelling sadists. These were educated, wealthy, powerful men who probably went home to their families afterward and asked about their children's day at school. Anne's wrists were pulled above her head. Her ankles were fixed at the other end of the wooden frame. Slowly, deliberately, they stretched her body until her shoulders and hips dislocated, until her joints tore, until she passed out from the pain. When she awoke, her arms and legs hung useless, detached inside her skin. Later, she wrote from her cell, "I was then racked with great cruelty, and they thought I would have uttered all things I knew, but I did not." She gave them no names, not even the Queen's. When the guards brought her food, she could not lift her arms. When they carried her to trial, she could not walk. And when they finally sentenced her to burn, she was still silent. Smithfield had never witnessed a spectacle like this. A woman too broken to stand, now bound for the flames. On July 16th, 1546, Anne Askew was dragged from her cell, her body held together by ropes and iron. She could no longer stand, so they tied her to a chair, and then they tied the chair to the stake. The authorities had hoped to break her in secret. Now they would destroy her in public. 3 other men stood beside her, reformers, condemned for their beliefs, but it was Anne the crowd had come to see. She wore a simple gown. Her hair had been shaved, her arms hung limp at her sides, but her expression was still serene, still unafraid. Before the torch was lowered, she spoke once more. "I am not come hither to deny my Lord and Master." Those were her final words. And then the flames rose. The chair caught quickly, smoke billowed into the sky. Her body, already ruined by torture, was consumed by fire. Even those who had called her a heretic wept that day. Chroniclers, hardened by war and violence, wrote that it was a cruel and unchristian act. But the regime got what it wanted, her silence. Or so they thought, because Anne had left behind more than ashes. She had written letters from the Tower. She had composed a series of meditations known as the ballad which Anne Askew made and sang when she was in Newgate. They spread quietly, secretly, defiantly through Protestant circles. Her words had survived, and her death became a spark. So what do we make of Anne Askew today? A martyr? A heretic? A footnote in the blood-stained annals of the Reformation, or something more? Anne Askew didn't fight with a sword. She fought with the truth. She was stretched on the rack, silenced by fire, and erased from court memory. But her story, her voice endured. In a world ruled by fear, Anne chose conviction. She chose to stand when her body physically couldn't. She was only 25 years old. Today, we read freely, we speak freely, but that freedom was paid for in blood, in silence, and in smoke. Let her story remind us that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes It burns quietly and refuses to be extinguished. If this story moved you, don't let Anne Askew be forgotten again. Like this video, subscribe for more untold truths from history, and share her name, because history lives on through those who choose to remember it.